Well, hello, everybody. Um, Welcome to Plenary 3. This is mapping ethics and with an emphasis on empathy. Um, I think I'm looking a little frozen there, but just wanted to let you know this is not an emergency. I'm in the hospital, but this is where I receive my chemo treatments over a span of 6 days. So that's where I'm coming to you from. And I will introduce our first speaker, our keynote speaker, Dr. Shislin Nelson. She holds a Jack and Laura Dangerman Endowed Chair of Geography in the Department of Geography at the University of California in Santa Barbara. From 2016 to 2020, she was director of the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Prior to that appointment, she was the Lansdowne research professor and director of the Spatial Pattern Analysis and Research Lab at the University of Victoria. As a researcher, she and her team develop and apply spatial and spatial temporal analyses to address applied questions in a wide range of fields, from ecology to health. She studied mountain pine beetle infestations, grizzly bears, and environmental change, but her current research focuses on active transportation and the use of big data and analytics to better plan cities. For example, Chislin and her team led the creation of or she led her team in the creation of bikemaps.org. And I encourage all of you to check the website out. It's awesome. It's a web map and an app to gather volunteer geographic information on cycling collisions and near misses. And it also incorporates Strava data. You may be using Strava. It's a great app that athletes use, cycling, swimming, running, but they have been very generous in making the data available to users doing research, looking at physical activity and exposure, for example, to pollutants and things like that. She uses bikemaps.org and other big data to quantify and monitor patterns of urban cycling safety and ridership. So I will turn it over to, Dr. Nelson.
Thanks so much, Marguerite. We're sorry you're not here with us today, but it's really nice that you joined us from your treatment, and hopefully we can distract you a little bit while we're here today. So I'm really honored to be asked to talk about ethics in GI science with a focus on empathy. And this presentation today, I'm really going to lean into a paper that I was lucky enough to co-author with Don Wright and Mike Goodchild. And I see that Don is here today for support from the audience, so that's really lucky for me. This paper was really special because it sort of started when I became the Dangerman Chair. I asked Mike Goodchild and Jack Dangerman to do a sort of passing of the torch in a way to pull together some people who'd been, obviously part of the Dangerman Chair. Mike was the original Dangerman Chair, and my talk was really on what I see as a trend in geography, or GI science, which is a growth in our focus on empathy. And after that, there was some conversations between Don and Mike and I, and we started working on this paper. And then Don got elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and this. I was lucky enough to be part of this paper, which was her inaugural contribution to PNAS. So this paper is probably the most special paper I've ever worked on. And so I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to continue that conversation today. But I wanted to just pick up on one of the themes in the paper. So I'm going to focus today mostly with some comments on data representativeness, which probably aligns most closely with the research that I'm doing now. But I think, just stepping back, why did I start to think about empathy in GI science? And I would say that when I was at Arizona State, we did a lot of hiring. And when we were doing those interviews from 2016 to 2020, around 2018, I started to notice this huge shift in who we were interviewing. So at the end of each interview, you have a one-on-one with the director. It's like the chair. And during those conversations, I noticed that increasingly the people that I was most interested in hiring were also people that were asking me a lot of questions about what the department was doing to support empathy, equity, and inclusion. And I also noticed in my own grad students, as I would interview people that I wanted to bring on to work in my lab, that the students that I was most aligned with were the ones that were asking questions like, what's the impact of my work going to be? What are we doing to help other people? What are the applications on the ground? And I see this as a shift in the culture of who we're attracting to geography and GI science, where in the past we were maybe a little more curiosity focused, and now the best and brightest talent is really impact focused. And if we are going to continue to thrive as a discipline, we need to find a way to support this generation of scholars. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. This is my daughter, Beatrice. She is probably one of the most empathetic people I've ever had the joy of interacting with, and she's also incredibly expressive. Here, I think she's identified something on her pizza that she's surprised by. But raising her has been a really interesting opportunity to see how when we are presented with things that are new, that are uncomfortable, that are unfamiliar, Beatrice will often have this reaction. It'll be like, what is that? And you'll see some kind of expression on her face that maybe looks like, confusion, or she's not quite sure what to do with it. This is Beatrice at her science fair project in grade 1. So I often think about this when she finds something like a bug that's really weird or that she hasn't encountered before, she will make the pizza face, like, what is this? And then her curiosity kicks in and she starts to ask questions about it. She loves nothing more than to identify something that we don't know what it is, and then it's her job to go figure out what it is. But as she learns about something, here she's learning about radishes growing in different kinds of soil, her interest in it grows. And as her interest in it grows, the ugly bug that she found in the garden becomes a friend, becomes something that she's quite curious about, quite interested in, and quite empathetic up towards. And I think that this is actually something that we see or that we want to be emulating in our geographic work. So empathy is really that you start to understand the feelings of someone else. You understand their perspective, and it requires curiosity. So that's good news, because as researchers, we are a curious bunch. And we are interested in generating knowledge, which can really lead the transformation from the pizza face to the science fair face. We have to be able to acknowledge that a lot of times we don't know what we don't know. And I think this is a mistake I've made in my own journey along the path towards being a more empathetic researcher, is that sometimes I think I know what I'm doing, but you have to be open to the fact that you might not know. And I think kids are a lot better at that than we are. So geography is poised to really increase empathy based on the types of problems that we work on. So we work on human problems, we work on physical geography problems, we work on the interaction between these things. And because we are coming to these questions often with care about the things we're studying, I think we are uniquely placed in the research and scientific realm to be empathy generators. The other reason that I think geography is well poised to pick up on empathy is because we are interested in variation. I mean, many scientists are, but we actually like to visualize and look at it and see how it expresses itself over the landscape, so that we're not always just focused on dominant signals, but we can also pick up the outliers and the variation that is maybe sometimes averaged out in other settings. So I just want to give you an example about something very specific and very, I think, cartographic about how we can generate empathy through research. So this is me and my husband heading out on a date. This is actually a Dutch bike, so I've got him in the front and I'm zipping down. And you can see by our faces how happy biking makes us. So for many years, I thought I was the only one that felt joy when I bicycle, but it turns out that many people feel this way. So bicycling is actually a wonderful response to the mental health crisis that we're having right now. There's physical benefits, there's health benefits, there's environmental benefits. So I see the bike as this wonderful aesthetic technology that we have ready to go to fight climate change and social injustice and mental and physical and wellness that we need to be leaning into. But one of the reasons that it's hard to do that is we have designed our cities really for cars. But we've not only designed just our cities for cars, we've also designed our data sets for cars. So we don't have good data on bicycling. So many cities have very little data on the number of bicycling, the amount of bicycling ridership that they have in their cities. So if they're trying to plan to increase it, it's hard to figure out where to make those investments, and it's near impossible to monitor the impact of those investments. So one of my passions is how do we create better data? And it's important right now to do that because we're seeing suddenly a massive investment in all kinds of infrastructure, including sustainable transportation infrastructure. So it's one of the, I'm here, I'm ready to go. We're gonna help make these decisions better. As I mentioned, we have a lack of data, and I think that this is an interesting intersection. There's lots of ways that empathy, I think, comes into this work. And one of the ways is that bicyclists and pedestrians tend to be the most vulnerable road users. And that vulnerability is not felt equally by everyone. If you live in a wealthy neighborhood with, lots of street calming traffic already implemented, you are going to be much safer than if you live in a lower income area. In fact, when I was writing a grant in Arizona, I took the bike crash data and I split it out by income from the census. And you were 4 times as likely to get hit on your bicycle if you were in the bottom quartile of the census tracts in terms of income. So it matters a lot. So one of the things that we're working on is bike volume data. So bike volume data is usually collected one of these 2 ways. So there'll be volunteer count programs. So Tempe, where I used to live, had an amazing volunteer count program. They'd send people out all over the city, and for a few hours, a few days of the year, they would collect data and they'd count the number of bikes going by. And so this is reasonable spatial coverage. You might get 40 or 50 locations throughout your city, but the temporal coverage is terrible. And then on the other hand, you have things like this permanent eco-counter. So eco-counter is a company that does an amazing job building technology that you can install to count bikes. And this means that you can put tubes in the ground and you ride over the tubes. I love it because you can see yourself be counted, which just makes me so happy. But it's really great temporal data, but you usually only have it for one location in your city because these are quite expensive to install. So we're really interested in Strava data. So do I have Strava users here? Yes, I have a few. So it tends to be a fitness app that people use to track where they ride. And it is interesting data because it's everywhere all the time. So even if you didn't know you should be collecting data, you can talk to Strava and they now give this data away for free. And it measures the number of Strava bicyclists on every single street segment around the world every 15 minutes. So it's this incredible data set. But it's biased towards people who use the app. So not everybody uses the app. Older adults are less likely to use it. People of color are less likely to use it. It tends to be used more by men. So in some ways, Strava is this amazing data set, but it primarily samples people who are already pretty comfortable biking. And if we want to plan for biking in our city, we need to incorporate everyone. So how can we do that? I'm not going to get into the details here, but I'd be so excited to talk to you about it after. But what we've basically done is we've taken the eco counter, so that installed counting equipment, and we've looked at how the number of bicyclists that are counted by that kind of equipment, which measures everyone, relates to our number of Strava users. And here's an example from Ottawa, Canada, where we found a very strong correlation between the Strava riders and all riders. So here we've said 1 Strava rider is basically equal to 37 total riders. And it turns out that this 1 to 37, this changes depending on your geography. So if you are on a recreational route, which tends to be hilly, maybe has really nice views, most of your Strava riders most of your ridership will be captured by Strava. But if you're on a quiet residential street where people are taking their kids to and from school, you're going to be undersampling by a lot more. But we're geographers, and we can represent that variation with GIS data. So we found that if we wanted to build a generalized model, we could incorporate the Strava sample of ridership, some measure of bike safety, so bike crashes, and then income from the census district, from the census survey. And with that, we could estimate the average annual daily ridership to an accuracy of plus or minus 10 riders for 75% of street segments. So we did this on 5 cities, 2 in Canada and 3 in the US. And we can come up with these maps, which, if you use them in a categorical way, I think they give you a pretty good indication of where your high, medium, and low ridership is, and they include everyone. So better bicycling data allows us to have a better understanding of how to support vulnerable road users. And when we incorporate everyone into our sample, I do think it allows us to have a data set that really reflects everyone and allows us to create more empathy. And I just want to give you an example about why this matters. So there's an organization, a state organization that hands out money. They don't hand it out. Based on really well-written grants, they allocate funds to improve road safety. And they look at vehicle safety, and they look at bike safety and pedestrian safety. And they use the number of crashes as their measure. So if you have a higher number of crashes, you have a better case to make for accessing these funds. There's 2 cities, Santa Barbara, where UCSB is, and Santa Maria, which is in the county of Santa Barbara, but it's a separate city, which is an agricultural city, which has a high population of Hispanic people, lots of agricultural workers. It's very suburban. It's very car focused. These are 2 cities that might be compared. So in Santa Maria, there's only 19 bike crashes. This was, I think, for 2019. Whereas in Santa Barbara, there were 40 or 94 officially reported. And I have, of course, cherry-picked some pictures, which, are examples of what these places are like. So the busier street is Santa Maria, and the nice coastal bike lane here is Santa Barbara. So if you just looked at the bike crash data, you would allocate the funds for bicycling safety to Santa Barbara. This is actually not the community that maybe need, though I would be very happy to have more bike lanes in Santa Barbara. This is not the community that is maybe most in need of support for safe cycling. So what we really need to do is be turning these into rates, which is this number of crashes divided by the total number of bicyclists, or the amount of bicycling exposure that's out there. And we need the Strava data in order to be able to do that. So I think that when we think, I'm very concerned as a GI scientist about the increased use of big data leaving people behind. I think the Strava is one example where we can actually quantify who might be left behind. But there's a lot of other data sets that we're using that I think we really need to be thinking about who are we leaving behind when we generate knowledge from these data sets. I think this is just one small example about how this could really lead to negative consequences for decision making if we're not careful. So it's more than just biking. As I said, I think we need to be turning these kinds of lenses towards the big spatial data that we're using, towards a variety of VGI that we might use that is always, it always struggles to have a representative sample. And I'm not here to say don't do those things or don't use those things, but really bring your most critical thinking to those data sets as you decide how to apply them and what to generalize from them. So in my last few minutes, I want to turn my attention to the end of this paper that we wrote. So I've talked a bit about data representativeness, which we link to empathy. In truth, we call this the 3 E's: ethics, empathy, and equity. And we came up with these different examples of each. It's a little artificial how we set this up because we needed a structure for a paper. I think these things, talk to one another for sure. We came up with 4 recommendations at the end, things to think about as you work towards the 3 E's in your own work. And the first, I think, is humility. I think we obviously haven't been getting it right all this time because the distribution or the demographics of who gets to participate in GI science and cartography, you could predict this based on gender, race, and other things. And so we want to be moving to a place where we get it right. And that means we have to be willing to look back and think about things that we've gotten wrong. And one of the things I'd encourage as a discipline is for us to think about how we can be transparent about bias in our data and algorithms. I have noticed in the review process, if I am transparent about my biases, I'm much more likely to get hammered by reviewers than if I don't shine the light on that. And so how can we create space for shining the light on that? And rather than, criticizing each other over that, try and find ways to work towards solutions. I also would love to see new criteria for reviewing journals. So what if we had a question in our journals about, how does this work? How could this work maybe improve our work towards the 3 E's or cause challenges? And there were times in my life when I would not have been open to that critique, but I feel more open to it now. And I hope that, as a community, we can open ourselves to that. I also think we need to be broadening measures of excellence. I think if we don't do that, we're at risk of losing a lot of talent, because I think the generation of scholars that we want to attract, they don't just care about the number of papers that they publish or the number of maps they produce. They want to know that they are making an impact. And I want to stand behind them and say, yes, let's make impact, because there are no shortage of challenges that we face at this particular moment in time. I think we are seeing some efforts towards that with broader impacts being part of our NSF applications, with knowledge translation being a big term in Canada, where I spent most of my career, particularly around health funding. The thing is I don't think we know how to measure social impact or community impact or impact on social good. And so I think when we don't have ways of measuring that, we run the risk of saying, well, it's all good, which means it's also maybe all not good. So how do we start to think about criteria for determining how to measure those sort of impacts so that we can include them in tenure and promotion packages and job application packages? And then I think also we need to find ways to reward efforts to take the most inclusive road. And my example of this is, so we've worked a lot on this bias correction of Strava data. And we do it in cities that have data. So we look around to see who has good training data for our models. And they're all predominantly white cities. And we sort of pressed on with this work because that's where the data were available. And then we realized that we are not generating generalized models. We are generating racist models because we're saying they're generalized, but they're generalized really only for white cities. And so we're trying to do the work in more racially inclusive cities, like the city of Oakland is one we're working with. And trying to get that data has been super hard. It requires new partnerships. It requires that we work with city staff who are oversubscribed. It creates safety challenges or perceived safety challenges for some of the students that I asked to go there and collect the data. So it was a lot harder than I thought, actually, to lead the data collection in a racially diverse city. And there's no difference in terms of, eventually I'm going to publish that data, and I will get the same credit for publishing that study as I did for the one where I just borrowed data from other people. So how do we account for that additional effort that's going to be required to be more inclusive? I think it's a challenge. Oh, here's something, I had to find a place to shove this in, so this is where I put it. So there's other kinds of activities that we might want to be doing. And one of the activities that I'm really interested in is how do we translate the knowledge that we're generating back to the communities that often pay for it? So taxpayers are funding a lot of our work. How much access do they have to our work? When we put it in peer-reviewed journals, it's, I think, possibly limited. So we've started a podcast called Earth Plus Humans. It's available on Apple and Spotify from the department website. So it's really all about some of the big challenges we're facing in the world and solutions that geographers are generating to address those challenges. So I'd encourage you to use these. These can be great lectures if you are traveling to AutoCarto and you need a lecture. You could consider one of these. We also need to think about how we're going to diversify our networks. So, if I had been working with my team was, it was a pretty white team that I have been doing this Strava work with, and we didn't really pick up on when we were picking cities to do this work. We were looking at size and bicycling culture, and we missed that we had picked all predominantly white cities. And if I had had a more diverse team, I think someone might have called us out on that earlier or provided different perspectives or had some different sampling criteria. So I think these diverse teams are super important. And we do have a lot of really great minds in GI science who are diverse, and that we want to be making sure that we are amplifying and connecting with and supporting in the work that we do. So how can you diversify your network? I'd say there's some really great minority serving institutions, HBCUs, but also GIS North Star is another great one. I'd really encourage you to support these organizations, to amplify the work that they're doing, to make sure on social media that you check to see who you're following and try and include more diverse voices. That is actually no cost to the people. That's no cost to the people that you're following to do that. I think we have to be careful about overburdening the diverse voices, and I think that's a good way that you can amplify without burdening. You should also think about what are meaningful collaborations. And actually, one of the reviewers to this paper had a great suggestion about snowball invitations. So when you are setting up committees, when you are inviting people to participate, it's very taxing if you invite diverse voices to join your table and they're the only one that has to represent, that perspective. So encourage snowball invitations where you say, we'd like you to come and we'd like you to bring a friend. Pick whoever you want, whoever you will feel supported by, bring them too. So I think these are some things that we can start to do. Another, I think, thing I'm actually now chair of the department. When I interviewed a few years ago, I said I would never be chair, but I am. And my number one passion for the department this year post-COVID is to build a supportive culture because we've all been apart for a long time. And I think that building a good culture, a place where people feel safe, a place where they feel connected, is actually one of the most valuable things that we can do to support diversity. Because when our culture is good, we have a little bit more capacity to handle differences, to invite inclusion. And so regardless of how much hiring you're doing in the next little while, I think that it's really important to be focusing on culture. Then lastly, I think we need to think about how to have inclusive education and workflows. So I was actually looking, here's my image of multiple pathways, but I was actually trying to look for the reverse image where you had multiple pathways ending at the same point. And I had troubles finding that. But I think, in academic culture, we have very prescribed way which we expect people to go through education. We graduate high school, and we know what we want to do, so we sign up for a geography degree. This basically never happens. Everybody has a nice story about how they found their way to geography. The more we can create alternate pathways, new entry points for people into cartography and GIS science, I think the better, because this will create, people need opportunities to catch up. They need different ways to engage in the material. They need to be excited about geography at different points. And I certainly found this myself. And we found at ASU, when we created online courses, this led to a much more diverse student body because it was a new way for people to engage that maybe didn't have access before. I just want to end on this point. So this is a familiar figure to many of us, that the normal distribution, we often look at our data and we want to make sure it's in that pink area in order to progress with our project. And I think that, there's lots of reasons why our methods are designed to look at the dominant trends. But I think when we do that, sometimes the most interesting things are in the tails. So if you just change this y-axis from just number of events into cultural and social influence, you'll see that if we're only looking at the middle part of this distribution, if we're only looking at what's already dominant, who already has access, the majority of the voices, we're actually going to cause a lot of trouble for trying to understand, people who are the least supported or people whose perspectives are different. And we need to, I really think about methods that allow us to amplify those tails. I think any data that you're collecting from your smartphone, I think, runs the risk of reinforcing what is already dominant and who already has access. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues. Lots of people helped with different, parts of this. Certainly I pull inspiration from many places. And I would love to stay in touch. This is the Bike Maps project that Marguerite mentioned. We have a pedestrian version of that. And then we're really excited by our podcast, and we hope that you will be too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flynn. I like that you, and often there are presentations that mention all the challenges and maybe what's wrong and what, what is not fair. But you, and especially in the second part of your presentation, you offer solutions. So I really like that. I apologize, my IV beeps when there's bubbles in the line, and it'll keep doing that, but I'll just reset it. Um, and stop it from beeping periodically. Um, so thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be some questions from the audience, so I'll hold mine maybe for the panel discussion, and see if I think that they'll have a microphone in the audience for you.
Any questions from the audience here in the auditorium? Okay, yeah, we have a question coming.
Is it on? Yes. Okay. Thank you. I loved I used to be a big cyclist, and I really watch the cyclists, what's happening in Athens and in my town with cycling. And they do a lot of good work, but my biggest concern has always been that I see a lot of, and this is where I want to know how do you get the data for the people that are living in the housing projects that are just trying to ride to work? Because if you're just going on the bicycle lanes, there's no bicycle lanes that go from the housing project to the chicken factory. There's no bicycle lanes that they're often riding on the sidewalks. They're often, and I mean, that's where they have to ride because they only have the bike as their, and our homeless community, actually, we have a lot of homeless. It's a big problem now. And a lot of them have bikes, and they're carrying all their whole everything they own somehow on their bike. And it's like, how do you get that data? Because you can't just, I wouldn't know how you would put the little tubes across anything to get that data. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that you have hit on the grand challenge of my life right now. Yeah, how do you get from data from really the people that you most need to represent in these projects? And I think there isn't an easy solution, and it is a time-consuming process. But I think it's really about stakeholder engagement. So you need to work with the people that are trusted by those communities and get them on board and compensate them for helping you collect those data. And it's not something that scales very easily. So you really need to focus on what's your research question, what decisions are you trying to impact, what data do you need, and then partner. And it's just a slow process. We've been doing that kind of work more on our pedestrian project, which is really about barriers to pedestrian environments. And it's slow, but it's, I think, really important.
We have one more question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a theater artist, so empathy is music to my ears. And you talked a little bit about the challenges of measuring social impact. I'm constantly thinking about how to measure or track or map empathy itself, what we feel for the other person or the connection between other people. Do you have any experience or any ideas about how we might measure or track the actual empathy? Not just that it's important, but how do we study that?
Yeah, so I haven't actually studied empathy directly. Empathy.org or empathymaps.org. We should do this. No, just kidding. I'm not an I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you. I do think though, I guess the one thing I think is that there's multiple scales under which we need to be tracking that. So societally, individually, and so I think it's not an easy thing, but clearly we are needing to move our society towards more empathy for one another. And would it be nice to have some interim measures because it might take us a bit.
If you have a question online, go ahead and ask.
Hi, thanks so much. This is Christy Caudle. Really appreciate your presentation. And as someone who is working pretty slowly and trying to develop this empathy-based coursework, particularly for geosciences, for geoscience in general, remote sensing, I'm wondering if you could offer any advice about how to get buy-in from departments and from universities about this really being a focus. And I think that it seems to me like a pretty easy sell, because I think you're right that people are coming into this impact focused and really empathy focused. And I feel like it is part of the, shared existential crisis that we're all in, and young people desperately want tools to cope with it and tools to be able to approach it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how to get buy-in from universities and departments. Thanks.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think with university, depending on the type of department you're in, often we have a lot of autonomy as professors about what we put into our coursework in terms of what there's there'll be some technical learning outcomes that we need to address, but then, how we do that, there's often a lot of flexibility. And my suggestion would be to lean in a little bit to that flexibility and just start doing it, because because getting buy-in, because I think we need some demonstration projects, I guess. So I think students will respond to that kind of curriculum. And so it will show up in your course evaluations and the number of students that you attract to your courses. And I think that might be the best way to when you have an opportunity to narrate why students are responding, that you can bring that into the narration, and that might be one way. I also think that our funding agencies, they maybe aren't calling it empathy, but they are looking for those kinds of stories. And so, I think relating it to what is happening national in terms of funding that's available for research is another good way to make that case.
Chisel, that's a great suggestion. I know that many times the university's missions include DEI, promoting DEI, and then it goes down to the department levels, but a lot of times people don't know what to do or what it is. And if you want to go ahead and add empathy and, and come under that umbrella, I think that's, from your coursework up. I think that's a great suggestion. And, we're working, our department head is very, empathetic for this, and so she's working with faculty to try to promote it as much as she can. So I think we'll move on now to the next panel members, but thank you so much, Ghislaine. And I just went in the order. Oh, thank you. I just went in the order of the panel members that were listed on the website. So I think Sam would be next. Sam Stell. I may not be pronouncing that correctly. It'll be, I believe he might be online, or is he in person?
I'm here. I am in person.
Oh, great. I see you. All right. I'll just give you a brief introduction. Sam is a data scientist at the U.S. Department of State Center for Analytics. He develops interactive dashboards and analytical products with machine learning. He improves data management policies with bureaus across the State Department. This includes work in cybersecurity, Eurasian and Asian Pacific affairs, and diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, DEIA, effort. So super interesting job, I'd say. Previously, Sam worked in the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and he managed spatial data and GIS projects for probably a lot of the natural disasters that we've had. He analyzed demographic data and hazard risk indices to contribute to equity projects. And he worked the logistics for the Maryland COVID-19 vaccination mission. So I'll leave it at that. You can read the rest of his bio online, and I'll let you go ahead with your presentation, Sam.
Thank you. Yes, I'm excited to be here, and thanks for the invitation to come speak about some of the previous work I've done before becoming part of the federal government as a geospatial data manager and a data scientist. This is some of this will probably not be new concepts to a lot of you. You're probably using Agile every day, but I wanted to kind of bring in a couple of concepts of user stories and user-centered design, and agile, and give one example from a postdoc I did at Maynooth University in the Building City Dashboards project with Rob Kitchen and Chris Brunsden and Martin Charlton. So I hesitate that to say that these are going to be strategies about including more empathy in development projects, in research, but maybe opportunities to generate empathy on a project scale. That's kind of where I want to come at this from empathy for the users in the development life cycle of the project. So the mantra of user-centered design, I guess it kind of all starts with know the user. And to me, that's a phrase used in user-centered design, but essentially it means be empathetical to the user. And user is kind of a fraught term because it's vague. It dissociates the developer, the analyst from the person, the end user. So I'm going to kind of table that for a moment because a user is a specific term, a specific person in the idea of user-centered design. So for now, I'm kind of going to use it as a group of people that will ultimately be creating meaning from the analytics, the product that you're creating. But we can come to that discussion in the future or afterward. So empathy mapping, I think, is a concept that is used in user-centered design that tries to translate the observations of users using a tool into something that is more usable for them. You create empathy with the user by watching them interact with the tool. What are they seeing while they're interacting with it? So we're kind of going around in this circle. It might be a bit small to see. But the first thing we want to start with the user in the center. It's user-centered design. So the user is in the very middle. How are they feeling about interacting with this tool, about using this tool and its capabilities? What are they saying? What are they doing while they're interacting with the tool? What are they hearing? And kind of and again, the empathy is the feeling. What are their pain points? What are they gaining while they're interacting with this tool? So this creates a shared understanding between the user of the tool and the developer of the tool. So you're making sure you're not missing that critical interaction. But this is kind of one part of it. I'm talking about this as a user observation, but if you integrate a survey and interact a one-on-one with the user, ask them about their experience. I think we've all done this at some point with research projects, with development projects. You get at some things that they may not even know that they're interacting with on the tool. So I'm going to get into that in my example here about this disconnect between what they're saying and what you're observing that they're doing. It was one of the key points of this research that I did with fellow postdocs at Maynooth University, led by Gareth Young. We were seeking to understand whether virtual reality could be used in the geography classroom to better understand geomorphological concepts. So we had teams of 3 students, one user inside the HTC Vive headset. They had a little room to interact with a scene that presented some geographical region that demonstrated this geomorphological concept. So the other 2 students were looking at the screen, were reading the lesson plan and giving direction to the person in the headset while they're moving around the virtual environment. And the instructor was also behind them offering advice, and 3 researchers on the project were observing the students. One focused on observing and giving technical advice to the student in the headset, the other 2 watching the other student participants. So we use this method, and these are, by the way, all of our observations as the students are working around inside of the virtual reality, as well as some of their students, their colleagues who are not in the environment but on the team. And kind of how they're interacting, awkwardly cautious, and feeling about using this environment. So we're trying to get at a couple of things, trying to understand the novelty of the system as a teaching tool, the individuality of it because only one person can be in the environment at a time, and how is this useful? So we created from this heuristics to guide the development of virtual reality in the classroom. But our real interesting part was were these nuggets of understanding. When we spoke to the students after observing them, they would tell us, "Yeah, this is great. I thought it was very smooth. It was not difficult to interact with. I was very familiar with this," while we're watching, and they're struggling to figure out how their movements create something in the environment. So there's a disconnect there. These nuggets of understanding say they're telling us one thing but acting in a different way. And so hoping that that kind of gives us a greater opportunity to see how they're interacting, to be empathetic with those students. Really quick, I want to just kind of go really quickly through the heuristics, because again, we're trying to determine how well this technique will work in the classroom. And these are kind of some questions that we think are important to ask based on our observations. How does it facilitate collaboration? We need to ask these questions because, again, it's an individual at a time in the system. But students were very well able to collaborate and speak with one another and give directions and, "No, it's over there. I know you probably can't see it because of peripheral vision and things." So, so these are questions that, again, we saw a very interesting correlation with people who use virtual reality outside of the classroom to play video games and other things, and feeling very confident about their interactions in the system, but maybe observing something a little bit different because now we're moving this environment into the classroom, providing a different context. So as I was writing this and kind of feeling proud about empathy mapping and kind of taking this concept, we're in a spatial conference and mapping, realizing that this is one large dose of empathy at the end of a project. We've already developed the program, where the classroom content. We'd developed the interactivity, the course questions. So it's a theme that's come up throughout this conference. How do we inject the empathy throughout the period of the project? So with that, I wanted to bring up agile methods, because this is something that I'm kind of curious who has worked or does work regularly with agile methods for development. And yeah, okay, quite a few. So I'll give a quick overview, and the idea of agile versus typical, say, waterfall method. The waterfall method gets you step by step. It's very sequential. We do this so that we can do that, so that we can do that. An agile method is iterative. We set up a sprint cycle, which can be a week, it can be 2 weeks, in which we have very specific set of tasks to do. And at the end of that sprint cycle, we come back, we do a sprint retrospective. How did this work? How did we work as a team? And this weekly structure allows us to work with a product owner or a user to tell us how things are going, how the process is creating our goals, is creating a deliverable. So this whole agile process is built around participation. It's built around the team being together every day, doing a stand-up. What did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? But more importantly, these roles of Scrum Master and Product Owner are opportunities to bring in different perspectives to the project. The Product Owner is a part of the user group who will say, we need to do more to work toward this deliverable. This week we need to work on this. So building in these other perspectives. It's also built around user stories. And at the very beginning of the project and throughout the project, that's why, again, this iterative component, we get to revisit user stories. As a blank, I want blank so that I can blank. So we're more opportunities. Again, this in itself is not empathetical, but it creates opportunities to be empathetic with the user and ask how improve the process. And finally, the sprint retrospective. As I said, at the end of every cycle, you go back and you get together with the team, and you take the user out of the equation and say, how did this work? Not like, how do we do? Did we accomplish the tasks we said we were going to do? It's more, do we have the things that we need to collaborate to be a useful team together? How are we working together as a team? And this internal empathy, I think, is a really important point that frankly often gets looked, in my experience, has gotten overlooked in the agile methods. So this is just kind of a an attempt at mapping some of the agile concepts with some of the things that we've been thinking about here in this conference, and how to bring empathy into that. I'm not going to kind of dwell on many of these because I'm not trying to say that that agile is the solution to all of this, but the user stories, user engagement are all opportunities to bring in to generate empathy among users, among the teammates, and use that representation to perhaps correct some of the faults when there isn't enough empathy. So kind of as a conclusion, Agile has continued to tell me that not only is the user the only end of a product, but the analyst, the researcher, the developer should also be considered a user. We're also important to the process. We're injecting our own bias, our own feelings into the system of creating a tool. So again, going back to a user story is important, but to say the user is the only important entity throughout this process perhaps ignores a lot of important opportunities to generate empathy. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. I guess in the interest of time, we'll hold questions for these individual panel presentations. And hopefully we'll have some, if you have a question, burning question, we can address it during the panel discussion. But we're getting a little compressed now. So I'll go ahead and introduce our next panel speaker, Clinton Johnson. He leads the Racial Equity and Social Justice team at Esri. And he, in doing so, as part of his job, he connects individuals and organizations from all sectors with geospatial data, technologies, and methodologies to advance equity at the intersection of all systems of oppression. He also founded and leads North Star of GIS, an NGO that advances racial justice, equity, and belonging for people of the Black and Black African diaspora in GIS, geography, and STEM. This employee community is focused on increasing representation, inclusion, and belonging for people of African descent in GIS. He is also an advocate for belonging and equity for people from underrepresented groups in GIS and STEM more broadly. So I will leave it at that and turn, I think we're going to see a video of his presentation next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Clinton Johnson, and I use he, him pronouns. My work involves helping people use a geographic approach to racial equity and social justice. And a geographic approach should inherently be an empathic approach. In the geospatial industry, one of the questions we should always ask is the geographic approach that we're using to address any given challenge or any area of interest, is that geographic approach empathic? At Esri, I organize efforts to ensure that our users have the geospatial capabilities they need to advance issues of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and access. All of which I believe is about empathy. Empathy is sharing the experiences and feelings of others by imagining their situation. Can you already begin to see how this applies to GIS and how cartography and geospatial thinking can help? GIS enables us to understand the impact of policies, investments, and other actions. We can explore how policies and actions influence what communities are exposed to and what communities have access to. We can explore the impact on people's real life experiences, and we can analyze and predict the impact on individual, family, and community outcomes. This also applies to who we engage and who we enable to do the work. We should always consider who maps, Who mapped the potential and actual impacts of COVID-19? Who mapped the potential and actual impacts of Hurricane Katrina? Who's mapping the impacts of climate change? Have you created diverse teams of people in your organizations and given them space and opportunity to bring their lived experiences into the ways that they leverage their professional expertise? We are certainly a community of geospatial practitioners who impact the lives of people of all backgrounds. What are we doing to ensure that we reflect the people whose lives we influence? All of these communities are impacted by intersecting issues of social injustice. Racial justice is about the elimination of all systems of bias and oppression. Now, many hear racial and assume that racial equity and racial justice stop somehow magically at an invisible border of racism. That's not a real thing. Racism doesn't simply share borders with other systems of oppression. All systems of oppression interact and influence each other in ways that help some and harm others, and in ways that are not always consistent. Racial justice is the systematic treatment of people of all backgrounds in ways that ensure equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. This work must be intersectional. I'll offer myself as a living example to explain why. There are times when people see me as a man and the benefits of sexism pile before me. There are times when people see me as young and the benefits of ageism pile before me. Then there are times when people see me as a young man, bursting with potential and great ideas, and a whole new set of benefits pile high. However, most often, people see me as Black, or a Black man, or a young Black man, and the burdens and barriers and the direct harms of racism stack high. Place matters as well. It matters if I'm walking through a predominantly Black neighborhood. It matters if I'm strolling or driving through a predominantly white neighborhood. When I've traveled to Europe, in some places, people have seen me as an American tourist coming to spend my money. Other times, people have assumed me to be an African immigrant coming to take their resources. Now imagine if I was a Black woman or a trans Black woman. It is impossible and impractical to try to separate racism from the other systems that people are helped by or harmed by. We need to address these issues in our maps and analysis, as well as in the broader global geospatial community. At Esri, I'm one of the founders of the first employee resource group focused on people of Black and Black African descent. And we work across the global geospatial community. We work to ensure that both the climate and culture of the geospatial community enable people of all backgrounds to find belonging. While inclusion is sometimes implemented as simply granting access to otherwise exclusive spaces, belonging is about ensuring that people have access to a space and resources to prosper in that space without the need to assimilate. And every time I think about this, I'm reminded of the time when a longtime friend of mine finally became a US citizen after nearly 40 years of living here. When I attended their ceremony, I'll never forget that everyone in that room swore an oath to assimilate and to help others to assimilate as well. Assimilation is loss. Organizers in the global geospatial community advocate for equity across our interconnected workplaces. That includes equity and representation at all levels, equity and experience, so that we all have great experiences in this industry, and equity in recognition. There are many highly skilled and highly qualified geospatial professionals who aren't always properly compensated and honored for the ways that they impact the community. And many of these people happen to be Black, other people of color, and women and LGBTQIA plus people of all backgrounds. We need organizations to embrace workplace equity for their employees, their customers, and the guests within their spaces. Since 2017, a grassroots GIS community called North Star has delivered engaging and educational events for over 3,000 guests, showcasing dozens of Black students and professionals sharing innovative solutions for business and social impact. In 2021, the North Star leadership team took our community organizing to the next level and formed a 501c3 nonprofit. We collaborate with others across the industry to create a racially just world through a racially just GIS. And by that, we mean a GIS community of practitioners that reflects the richness of the Black African diaspora and the GIS community of practice that centers intersectional racial justice. The geospatial community is working in and around the systems that could help every family and every community prosper. So we need an empathic and equitable geographic approach. We need to seek to understand how policies, programs, and services have and will impact communities across the country. We need to disaggregate data, meaning we need to aggregate data to the intersections that matter. We need an approach that seeks to understand the root causes of experiences and outcomes by mapping and analyzing the ways that decisions and practices influence community conditions and ultimately influence those outcomes. We need a systematic approach that assesses inequities, explores policy alternatives, and automates equity interventions, and enables continuous improvement, all while keeping communities engaged in the process. There are many ways to combine geospatial data, tools, and practices to operationalize racial equity and social justice. There isn't just one solution. We need a systems approach or a systematic approach. Now, I've said plenty, and if you remember only a few things, please remember these. An empathic geographic approach to racial equity and social justice is intersectional. It allows you to focus on all the intersections of race, income, gender, sexual orientation, location, and all the other intersections that matter. It's outcome focused. It helps you to better connect the dots between policies and community conditions to help create equitable outcomes. It's systematic. It allows for a comprehensive orchestration of geospatial capabilities to push back against systems of oppression. This applies to making sure that our cartographic products result in racial equity and social justice. This applies to creating a global geospatial community that reflects the rich diversity of the world we impact. And it applies to the ways that we organize in the GIS community to create the change that we need, the change that the world deserves. Thank you all for listening, and thanks to the organizers of this conference for creating space for this conversation. And thanks to all of you in advance for continuing to support justice, equity, and belonging through an empathic geographic approach.
Thank you very much, Clinton. you provided a lot of food for thought, and also, if you're open to it, material for my classes, and I'm sure others as well. And we'll move on to our next speaker. We're into our panel discussion time, but this is so important and worthwhile. Dr. Matthew Hauer is our next speaker. He's an assistant professor of sociology and a faculty affiliate in the Center of Demography and Population Health at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. His expertise lies at the intersection of demography, migration, population projections, and climate change. His research focused on how migration induced by sea level rise could reshape U.S. population distribution. More than 270 media outlets have hounded him and covered the research. So the coverage is good, but it comes at a price. He had a recent review article on sea level rise and human migration that describes one of the most costly and permanent consequences of climate change. So I'll leave it at that and let you go ahead, Matt, with your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Wish I could be there. Unfortunately, I had some changes go on in my personal life that were a little out of control, making it a little difficult to make a trip to California. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. This is going to be a little bit more research heavy that goes into how it might relate to empathy. But I'm going to talk about some of my work around demographic change on the U.S. coastline, in particular about thinking through demography and how we should think about different populations and so on who might be affected by something like climate change. So I'm in a department of sociology. My PhD's in geography, and I'm trained as a formal demographer. So I wear all sorts of different types of hats when thinking about this kind of work. So sort of where I'm kind of coming from when I think about my work are two major trends. One is demographic, that the US and really the global populace is going to age and diversify this century. It's going to continue to get older and more diverse. And at the same time, climate impacts are going to worsen as the century progresses. And I think that thinking through either one of these trends individually doesn't really shed light on thinking about what these impacts mean for our country, for our people in our country, and for the world. So essentially thinking about this kind of thing at the same time as this kind of thing, right? That we have climate change occurring and we have a population that's diversifying and aging is the second part. That's part of the other demography. And I'm focusing on coastal areas for a couple of reasons. One, almost half of the US population lives in a coastal community, and coastal areas, both domestically and abroad, are some of the most rapidly growing areas. And so thinking through sea level rise and tropical cyclones and storms and sort of impacts, coastal areas are one of the communities that are at the forefront of these changes. And I think that if you think about what we should do about climate change and how we should best protect our populations that are most threatened and exposed, I think thinking about demographic changes can really help us make, hopefully, better, equitable decisions for protecting these populations. So it's not just thinking about, the numbers of people, but also who these people actually are. Who are we talking about in many of these areas? If you look at the coastline today, most of the coastline is right around 50% white non-Hispanic. It's just barely below what we would describe in demography as a majority-minority community. But by the end of the century, the coastline, who resides in a coastal county in the United States, is going to be increasingly diverse. So when we think about who is impacted by climate effects, if we just think about populations today, we're going to miss the rapid diversification that is going to unfold in coastlines. So who's actually going to be impacted is going to be an increasingly non-white population. Populations that in the future were not contributing to this problem in any really meaningful way. If we look at the coastline as well, if we map it geographically, this is just showing the largest race group in each county, and the darker the color, the more concentration of that race group there is. And you can see that most of the coastline is dominated by that dark blue, which indicates 75+% of a county's population are white, non-Hispanic. But by 2100, that blue hue, that deep blue, is really blunted. And instead, who resides in coastal areas is a much more diverse area. And it's no longer sort of like white areas all over the coastline. We end up with a much stronger mix of race and ethnic groups. So again, thinking about who's impacted by sea level rise or climate impacts, we sort of have to think about who's going to be residing in those areas when those impacts are greatest. I did mention as well that aging and the coastlines are going to experience some very pronounced aging into the future. Here's just a real classic population pyramid. The hollow bars are the population in 2100, and then the stem and leaf, the red, is where we're at today, the sort of the population structure today. So today we have a relatively youthful population structure, but by 2100, and as the century kind of goes on to get there, the coastline continues to age. And by the end of the century, we're looking at about 3 times as many people over the age of 65 than we currently have. And you can look at the percentage of the population as well. Today, it's about 1 in every 6 people. By the end of the century, we're looking at more than 1 in every 3rd. And if you do a simple comparison, how do we put those numbers in perspective? Japan, we oftentimes think of as being a very old population. And today, Japan is about 1/4 of its population is over the age of 65. So if we sort of think about who's going to reside in these areas and the adaptation strategies that we employ to protect those individuals, the different mitigation effects and so on, we're talking about very different populations tomorrow than we have today. And for many of these areas, we'll see virtual stagnation in all the populations under what we consider today to be retirement age. So the blue is our working age population. I'm sorry, the green is our working age population. The blue is our young population. Those are people under the age of 20. And that red line that keeps growing, that's our population over the age of 65. So who's going to reside in coastlines in the future is going to be an increasingly older population with all of the sort of implications that come along with an aging population and an aging society. Even if we think about it in terms of median age, these are the most populous coastal counties in the United States, and all of them, for the most part, will see significant aging by the end of the century. The black dot is 2050, so we're looking at many areas getting much older, much quicker. To put these numbers in perspective, the median age in the US today is right around 33. So having median ages that are over 50 is virtually unheard of. And again, to put it in perspective with Japan, we're looking at a median age of about 48. So many of these areas will be older than Japan is today, what we consider to be, an older country. Now, maybe you're asking yourselves, okay, the coastline is aging and it's diversifying, but is that the case everywhere? Isn't this just a secular demographic trend? And the answer is yes, it is. This is going to be occurring all over the United States. The more golden you see here, the more population we have over the age of 65 in each county to the end of the century. And when we compare it to today, the US is much more youthful than the end of the century. So in one sense, yes, these are just secular sort of demographic trends, but coastlines are a little bit unique as well. So while it is secular, it's not entirely secular. The blue lines here, the blue panel, those are going to be our coastal areas, and the yellow, the sort of sandy color, is our inland areas. And so today, our coastal areas are more diverse than our inland areas, and they stay diverse throughout the rest of the century. But in terms of median age, the difference between inland and coastal areas is currently not significant. They're virtually the same. But by the end of the century, coastal areas will be much older or significantly older than what we have in inland areas. So coastal areas are likely to be older and more racially diverse by 2100 compared to inland areas, and that coastal areas are aging more rapidly than inland areas. So why does this matter? Why sort of think about these towards the end of the century, and what does this mean for thinking about our communities and sort of being empathetic to diverse populations? Right, these are patterns, these are things that are happening today. These are photos that are contemporary. These are impacts in our coastal communities already with coastal flooding, tropical cyclones, storm surge, and so on. And when we think about these today, the populations that are affected are going to be markedly different. And these demographic shifts are extremely important for understanding things like the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. When we think about equity and environmental justice, who's impacted? It really matters for adaptation strategies and who gets protected and how they get protected. Perhaps building a second floor, adding a second story to your home to protect against rising water levels maybe isn't such a wise idea if the people who are going to be living in those areas are going to be older. It also impacts, what we consider to be migration as adaptation. Older people are much less likely to migrate. So if we need to employ migration as adaptation, how do we go about moving these people and providing the right resources to the right people to get them to safer areas? And it also matters for when we think about mitigation of carbon emissions and sort of building a more sustainable world, because emissions change over your life course, and older populations and more diverse populations use carbon differently. Yet, when you look at the broader literature on these sort of demographic patterns, I think these are still pretty rare. And I think that we could have a better handle on trying to tackle climate change in equitable manner if we think about these sort of a broader demographic shifts when we analyze and think about climate change and for climate impacts. I really hope that we can build a more just and equitable future, and it's hard to do so if we're missing a moving target, if you will. And then in the interest of time, I just want to say thanks and leave a little bit of time, hopefully, for any kind of questions.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, this is a great reminder that in our work, if we're working with present data, think about projecting into the future and pushing ourselves into that uncomfortable place where it's uncertain, but it is important to go there. And your work is really would help to give some idea about population change and demographic change. So I highly recommend your literature. Everybody can go to it. We're going to transition now to our panel discussion. And I think we have two of the speakers, Chislin and Sam in the audience, and the rest of us will be online virtually. Thank you for the organizers for making this possible to have a hybrid panel. I know we're getting close to lunchtime too, so we may not get to all the questions, but I would love to hear from each of our panelists a little bit about what influenced your interest in ethics and mapping and your focus on empathy. We heard a little bit about your journeys in your presentations, but I'd love to ask the panel, everybody, the same question. So we'll just go in the order of the presentations, and if you could take a minute or so. Chislin, do you want to say, is this something you've been thinking about all of your career, or was there something that came up that really hit home to you?
Thanks for the question. Thanks to my co-presenters. I wish that you were all here together. I've been trying to meet Clinton for a long time, so I was disappointed. But I would say this is it is not something I've thought about for my whole career. I really started out, passionate about pattern. I'd say. But as I transitioned to a leadership role at Arizona State University, it was a very strange time for me personally, going from Canada to the US in 2016. I moved just before the election, which was such a confusing time, I think, for a Canadian in the US. And I was in charge of a much larger school than I had been involved with before, and it was more diverse. And the range of challenges that people faced were just a lot more than I had to address and maybe even be aware of. I remember have a student, it was just after the election, I had a student quit showing up to class, and we couldn't figure out why. This was a student that had always been very engaged and had good grades. And it turned out she was a Muslim student, and someone had driven by her house and thrown rocks through her window. And her father was very scared and didn't want the kids going to school for that period of time. And, you know, coming from Victoria, Canada, I was so confused, and I was put into a position where I had some responsibility for how the school responded to that. And it required me to dig deep and learn a lot. And so, I mean, I think, you know, and then some of the other things that happened, I think that made it more focused, brought it out as more of a focus of my research was some of the interaction with this next generation of researchers, I think. But I also want to express gratitude to Dawn for working on this paper with me. I've learned a lot from working with her. And Clinton, I forget even, I think it was when I first met Jack Dangerman, he asked me to meet with Clinton, and Clinton has taught me a ton. And I just want to express a lot of gratitude for the support that I've received even from this community along my journey. I'm really grateful.
Great. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think hearing personal stories and just learning, talking to each other is invaluable. Sam, do you have kind of an experience to share?
I don't think I can necessarily point to a single situation that was maybe the moment, but I think I've always been a bit critical of my own data representativeness, and I can picture parts of graduate school taking geopolitics classes and learning about the representativeness of data and of the research you're doing, and I think that's kind of always stuck with me in trying to not pigeonhole the data, the analytics, the questions you're asking, and one particular situation in my more recent past is when working with FEMA and trying to respond to executive order. I'm trying to remember the number. I think it's 13526. I think those are the right numbers. They might be in different order, but it was basically challenging all of the federal agencies to quantify their the equity and how they're delivering programs to citizens, as well as representation in their own workforce. So trying to come up with some of those questions within a region of FEMA was an eye-opening experience as well.
Oh, thanks. And I can imagine FEMA is such a monolith organization, and you're doing your best, but it needs to be incorporated somehow. That's great. Clinton, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. This is a really good question, I think. So after many years of working in spaces where Black people and other people of color were in the building, but not really in the room, whether that room was technology or decision making, I then came to Esri, where I was 100% of the Black people in the building. And this was during another period of time when we were basically being bombarded with videos of Black people being brutalized or killed by our country's public safety officers. And guess what? We weren't being bombarded with that imagery. Most of the people that I worked around seemed to have no idea or no empathy for what was happening. Now, at the same time, I was working with cities and counties, or big cities and counties with big cities, all of which were asking for our help using GIS to address issues of racial equity and social justice. I mean, some of them were almost commercials, for our technology. They would say things like, I recently started working here, and we know that our policies are creating disparities for people based on race and income and other factors. And we know that you all have geospatial data that can help us, do something about it. Help us find the neighborhoods and the ways in which our policies are creating disparities for people. And all too often, I was simultaneously the only Black person in GIS in that room, and the only GIS person engaging in the conversation, whether it was the GIS team that worked for that organization or our own. So it became important to me to really do something about that.
Oh, it's unfortunate that you had these crises that came together, but it was a spark, I think, and you're taking it forward. So I have some students in mind that I'm going to connect to North Star, and I know your network is just going to grow. So thank you for your efforts, from the academic perspective and what your work is doing. Matt, you want to say a few words?
Yeah. So as a demographer, I never critically engaged with demography itself until I was really confronted with how the data systems that demography sort of sets up can reinforce various systems of oppression. And the time when it really clicked with me was looking at the question in the 1970 census about head of household. And the only option was head of household or wife. It was literally impossible for a woman to be a head of a household in the 1970 census. And that sort of the way that those data guardrails, I guess, that force people into specific categories. I now think about that in almost all of my work and thinking about how is my own work either reinforcing those systems or working to sort of maybe in some ways push against them at the same time. So that was when it was really eye-opening, and I was like, whoa, wait a minute, you can't choose anything, literally anything else.
Right. I remember you saying that there are people who do these census forms and there's no box for them at all for their self-identity. So I think we're maybe moving towards something a little better, but we're not there yet. So we're really coming up to your lunch hour, and I appreciate that everybody, I sent the questions out yesterday and I know you prepared to answer them, but why don't we take the last minute or two if any of you have a burning statement you'd like to make, or if there's a burning question in the audience, we could take it. I can't see the audience, so maybe you could see if there's a hand up or
We have a
Is that right? You do have a
Thank
question?
you. Yeah, there's a question.
Great, thanks.
Is this on? Okay, this is on. Thank you. I really love this panel and this plenary. Thank you so much. And Tristan, I'll just say that working with you on that paper was the best experience I've had working on a paper. It was wonderful. I really liked Sam's point about the user. We focus on the user and user interface and user experience, but the makers, that has to be something to be considered as well. And I think Clinton's video made that point as well in terms of workforce, diversifying the workforce is going to be so critical. So that led me to a question from Matt, because I learned so much from Matt's presentation about the demography of our country and the aging of our coastline. I wondered, Matt, I hope that we're moving towards a diversification of the cartography GIS workforce, but do you think that workforce is aging, will age as well? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yes. When I was at just as an example, the one federal agency that well, maybe not the only one, but one of the ones that should be most prepared for aging would be the Census Bureau, which is the largest concentration of demographers in the federal government. And yet, when I was at the Census Bureau about a decade ago, over 40% of their workforce were boomers and approaching retirement ages, and they still hadn't quite fully prepared. So, yeah, I don't know if but just judging on that, I doubt the cartography is ready for the aging tsunami as well. To put it mildly, because very few organizations, institutions, disciplines, and so on are really positioned for it.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And any of the other panelists want to comment on that? I know you're working directly trying to improve that, Clinton.
Yeah, a lot of us are definitely trying to get the folks in the industry, people who are hiring, to think about we don't have to make up anything new, any new, great practices for inclusive hiring. There are a lot of great practices out there, but reaching out to historically Black colleges and universities, reaching out to students in low-income communities and communities of color, and schools serving predominantly communities of color, getting people early and interested in geography early. And I always think about, once someone taught me about GIS or told me about GIS, I wanted to learn about GIS a little bit more. Very often the subject matter was focused on things that I could not really imagine. Volcanoes, things that didn't matter in my life growing up. And I always wonder, like, what would that look like for someone in high school or the high school age Clinton? Did I miss geography and GIS because it wasn't being showed to me in a way that would engage me? So I think we got to start thinking about how we communicate the importance of value of geography to a broader audience. Now, we're all bringing our passions to the work that we do, and when we think about what excites us about GIS and geography, that shows up in the ways in which we promote it. So we need to tap into broader perspectives today, so we're promoting geography as an opportunity, career opportunity, and an opportunity to have impact to younger people from diverse backgrounds.
Great. Yes. My first exercise in my class is, because it's image understanding, is looking, I say, pick your favorite place. It could be where you grew up or where your vacation, but something and find imagery and tell us about it. So I really do try to personalize that, and then expand out geographically from there. Well, we're into your lunch hour, your time, so I guess we'll end this panel discussion. And I hate to cut it short. It's been fantastic. I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody has enjoyed it. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll join you virtually for the rest of the conference. So thank you.
Take care, Marguerite.
Hi, everyone. Before we break for our break instead of our lunch, I just had a couple of announcements. First of all, Amy, where are you? Okay, we'll hold on that. Number two, people are looking for rides to airports and things. There was something that went out last night that allowed you to sign up online to help people get to and from airports and things. So, but if you didn't get into that list, the online sign up sheet, there's one out on the registration desk for you. Also, following our break is a special session in honor of Lynn Ursery. And I think most of the people in this room know how much of an impact he had on our discipline. And I also encourage you to look at the slides that are rotating between sessions, because we've lost a number of really important people, and we want to make sure we remember them. We have a couple sessions, concurrent sessions after lunch, and then we have a closing session from 3 to 4. You won't want to miss that, because we have some really excellent raffle prizes for you. And if people are leaving, that means your chance of winning is better. But we'll also hear about some awards, some acknowledgements. We also have a video and a presentation about ICC 2023, and we'll remind you about how we can help you to get there. And finally, there's an Esri tour, a final Esri tour from 4 to 5. So if you're interested in that, meet in the lobby at 4 o'clock. And now Amy has a very quick thing to do. Let's save it for the end of the Lynn Ursary session. She has some prizes to give out. So go ahead, have your break. We'll see you in less than half an hour, right back in here. This is the only session we'll be in here after the break. Thank you. Right here.